Welcome back, readers. This week is a long, short story. It's almost just a story, in my opinion. The explorer had inclined his ears to the officer, and with his hands in his jacket pockets, watched the machine at work. The condemned man watched it too, but uncomprehendingly. He bent forward a little and was intent on moving needles when the soldier, at a sign from the officer, slashed through trousers, from his shirt and trousers from behind with a knife so that they fell off. He tried to catch at his falling clothes to cover his nakedness, but the soldier lifted him into the air and shook the last remnants from him. The officer stopped the machine, and in sudden silence the condemned man was laid under the harrow. The chains were loosened, and the straps fastened on instead. In the first moment, that seemed almost a relief to the prisoner, and now the harrow was adjusted a little lower, since he was thin. When the needle points touched him, a shudder ran over his skin. While the soldier was busy strapping his right hand, he flung out his left hand blindly, but it happened to be in the direction toward where the explorer was standing. The officer kept watching the explorer sideways, as if seeking to read from his face the impression made on him by the execution, which had been at least curiously explained to him. The wrist strap broke, probably the soldier drawn it too tight. The officer had to intervene. The soldier held up the broken piece of strap to show him, so the officer went over to him, his face still turned toward the explorer. This is a very complex machine. It can't be helped that there are things breaking or giving way here and there, but one must not thereby allow oneself to be diverted in one's general judgment. In any case, this strap is easily made good. I shall simply use a chain. The delicacy of the vibrations for the right arm will of course be a little impaired, and while he fastened the chains, he added, the resources for maintaining the machine are now very much reduced. Under the former commandant, I had free access to a sum of money set aside for this purpose. There was a store too, in which spare parts were kept for repairs of all kinds. Sorry, I have to touch this thing every 5 minutes or it goes blank and I think it stops recording. I confess, I have been almost prodigal with them. I mean in the past, not now, as the new commandant pretends, always looking for an excuse to attack our old way of doing things. Now he had taken charge of the machine money himself, and if I send for a new strap, they ask for the old broken strap as evidence. And the new strap takes 10 days to appear, and then is of shoddy material and not much good. But how I am supposed to work the machine without a strap, that's something nobody bothers about. The explorer thought to himself, it's always a ticklish matter to intervene decisively in other people's affairs. He was neither a member of the penal colony nor a citizen of the state to which it belonged. Were he to denounce this execution or actually try to stop it, they could say to him, you are a foreigner, mind your own business. He could make no answer to that, unless he were to add that he was amazed at himself in this connection. For he traveled only as an observer, with no intention at all of altering people's methods of administering justice, yet here he found himself strongly tempted. The injustice of the procedure and the inhumanity of the execution were undeniable. No one could suppose that he had any selfish interest in the matter, for the condemned man was a complete stranger, not a fellow countryman, or even at all sympathetic to him. The explorer himself had recommendations from high quarters, had been received with great courtesy, and the very fact he had been invited to attend the execution seemed to suggest that his views would be welcome. And this was all the more likely, since the commandant, as he had heard only too plainly, was no upholder of the procedure, and maintained an attitude of almost hostility towards the officer. At that moment, the explorer heard the officer cry out in rage. He had just, with considerable difficulty, forced a felt gag into the condemned man's mouth, when the man, in an irresistible access of nausea, shut his eyes and vomited. Hastily, the officer snatched him away from the gag, tried to hold his head over the pit, but it was too late. The vomit was running all over the machine. It's all the fault of that commandant, cried the officer, senselessly shaking the brass rods in front. This machine is befouled like a pigsty. With trembling hands, he indicated to the explorer what had happened. Have I not tried for hours at a time to get the commandant to understand that the prisoner must fast for a whole day before the execution? But our new mild doctrine thinks otherwise. The commandant's lady stuffed the man with sugar candy before he's let off. See, this is a nice story. Sugar candy. This is fun. He has lived on stinking fish his whole life. Now he has to eat sugar candy. He gets to eat sugar candy. Kafka. But it can still be possible. I should have nothing to say against it. But why won't they gag me? Why won't they get me a new felt gag? Which I've been begging for the last 3 months. How should a man not feel sick when he takes a felt gag into his mouth, which more than 100 men have already slobbered and gnawed on in their dying moments? The condemned man had laid his head down and looked peaceful. The soldier was busy trying to clean the machine with the prisoner's shirt. The officer advanced toward the explorer, who in some vague presentiment, that's a word, fell back a pace, but the officer seized him by the hand, drew him to one side. I should like to exchange a few words with you in confidence, he said. May I? Of course, said the explorer, and listened with downcast eyes. This procedure and method of execution, which you are now having an opportunity to admire, has, at the moment, no longer any open adherents in our colony. I am its sole advocate, and at the same time, the sole advocate of the old commandant's tradition. I can no longer reckon on any further of this method. It takes all my energy to maintain as it is. During the commandant's lifetime, the colony was full of adherents. His strength of conviction I still have in some measure, but not an atom of his power. Consequently, the adherents have skulked out at night. There are still many of them, but none of them will admit it. If you were to go to the tea house today, on execution day, and listen to what's being said, you would perhaps hear only ambiguous remarks. These would all be made by adherents, but under the present commandant and his present doctrines, they are of no use to me. And now I ask you, because of this commandant and the women who influence him is such a piece of work, the work of a lifetime, he pointed to the machine. To perish? Ought one to let that happen, even if one has only come as a stranger to our island for a few days? But there's no time to lose. An attack of some kind is impending on my function as judge. Conferences are already being held in the commandant's office, from which I'm excluded. Even your coming here today seems to me a significant move. They are cowards, and use your screen, you stranger. Use you as a screen, you stranger. How different execution was in the old days. Oh, the good old days. A whole day before the ceremony, the valley was packed with people. They all came only to look on. Early in the morning, Commandant appeared with his ladies. Fanfares roused the whole camp. I reported that everything was in readiness. The assembled company, no high official dared absent himself, arranged itself around the machine. The pile of cane chairs is a miserable survival from that epoch. The machine was freshly cleaned and glittering. I got new spare parts for almost every execution, before hundreds of spectators, all of them standing on tiptoe as far as the heights there. The condemned man was laid under the harrow by the commandant himself. What is left today for a common soldier to do was then my task, the task of presiding judge, and was an honor for me. Then the execution began. No discordant noise spoiled the working of the machine. Many did not care to watch it, but lay with closed eyes in the sand. They all knew, now justice is being done. In the silence, one heard nothing but the condemned man's sighs, half muffled by the felt gag. Nowadays, the machine can no longer wring from anyone a sigh louder than the felt gag can stifle. But in those days, the writing needles let drop an acid fluid, which were no longer permitted to use. Well, and then came the 6th hour. It was impossible to grant all the requests to be allowed to watch it nearby. The commandant, in his wisdom, ordained that the children should have preference. I, of course, because of my office, had the privilege of always being at hand. Often enough, I would be squatting there with a small child in either arm. How we all absorbed the look of transfiguration on the face of the sufferer, How we bathed our cheeks in the radiance of that justice, achieved at last, and fading so quickly. What times these were, my comrade! The officer obviously had forgotten whom he was addressing. He had embraced the explorer and laid his hand upon his shoulder. The explorer was deeply embarrassed. Impatiently, he stared over the officer's head. The soldier had finished his cleaning job and was now pouring rice pap from a pot into the basin. As soon as the condemned man, who seemed to have recovered entirely, noticed this action, he began to reach for the rice with his tongue. The soldier kept pushing him away, since the rice pap was certainly meant for a later hour, yet it was just as unfitting that the soldier himself should thrust his dirty hands into the basin and eat out of it before the other's avid face. The officer pulled himself together. I didn't want to upset you, he said. I know how impossible it is to make those days credible now. Anyhow, the machine is still working, and it's still effective in itself. It is effective in itself, even though it stands alone in this valley, and the corpse still falls at the last into the pit with an incomprehensible, gentle wafting motion. Even although there are no hundreds of people swarming around like flies as formerly, in those days we had to put a strong fence round the pit. It has since been torn down. When I see the connection, though I see I don't spare, I stare, though I see I'm vibrating with love and light, pulsating with love and light in a world